Welcome back to Communicology. Have you ever wished your favorite celebrity would just shut up and play their sport or sing their song or act in a movie? You're not alone. Today I'd like to talk about how social media has ruined celebrity mystique. But before we get into it, if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate that. So, when I was younger, quite a while ago, I used to be a DJ. I used to work in radio and actually enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. And it was actually really kind of cool to sit there and play the music that people would call in and request and do that kind of thing. And occasionally I would go out on events. And one event that stuck out to me, I went to this street fair and I was manning the radio station, booth, and we were broadcasting. And actually I was broadcasting from a large boat. So I was on top of one of those pontoon boats. But I had people that came up to me and wanted to meet me because I was on the radio. And it was kind of weird. I mean, at the time, I was, I think, like 19, maybe 20. And I had people who literally wanted to come up and meet me simply because I was on the radio. In their mind, I was famous. And it was a weird thing because, I'm just a college kid paying some bills, doing some radio stuff, enjoying that time. But there's a mystique that comes with being, out there in mediated space. And before social media, you did pay a lot of attention to who was on the TV screen, who was over the radio waves, who was in the magazines, and who was up on the big screen in the theaters. And we didn't know much about them. All that we knew is what came filtered through. And probably one of the most open examples of that was the DJ. So early in music, radio, rock and roll history, you go into the 50s and 60s, and there were lots of cases where the DJ was more popular than the singers because the DJ was on all the time. He was like that friend that was always at your fingertips, whether at home or in the car, and he was the constant. So you got to hear his lively personality and his radio voice, and it just hooked you in, and there was that thing. You didn't even know what he looked like. You just heard him, and you just knew that he was someone special because he was on the radio. So you move into the world today, and thanks to things like social media, we know everything about everyone, and it's kind of not fun anymore. There's no mystique. There's no mystery. We know everything. We know how they think about things. We know what they have for breakfast, and we know what their politics are. We know what their views on all kinds of world events are. And quite frankly, it's quite off-putting. It's not as fun to have that allure of mystery that used to be there, and it's just not anymore. So the idea of knowing everything is just not quite as fun. Now, it used to be that celebrities, now not me as a small-town DJ, but celebrities, would have handlers. They still have handlers. They still have, public relations teams and agents and things like that to keep a hold of them and keep them regulated. But they used to be very regulated. You go back into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, and they were very regulated because, quite frankly, once people have that little bug that I want to know more about somebody, they start trying to press and find out more about somebody. So you'd have like throngs of people showing up whenever there's a sighting of some particular celebrity. It wasn't uncommon, growing up, there's this outlet mall outside the town where I grew up, and it's an hour north of Pittsburgh, and you'd have these celebrities that would kind of go up to, our town to have dinner alone, because a lot of times people necessarily didn't know them. If they did know them, they left them alone, but in their hometown, they're just swamped everywhere they went, and they couldn't escape, and they just want to have some normalcy. Well, again, before social media, you have the idea that people could just, kind of, blend in, but then people would swamp them and want to know more about them, and they'd ask them all kinds of questions, personal questions, because the "hi, how are you" only goes so far. They want to know more details. And it's common, too, that if we have heroes, if we have people we admire, people to whom we look up, we want to know more. We want to know as much as we can. That's like whenever you start dating. You start asking a million questions to get to know that person as much as you possibly can. So it's not uncommon to see that with celebrities. So whether it's an athlete, a movie star, a radio star, it doesn't matter. It's just one of those people you just want to know everything about. So we were fed just tidbits of information now and then. You might see an occasional glimpse at an award show. They might be sitting there, and maybe they'll win an award. They'll go up and actually say a few words, and we hung on those words. Maybe there might be an exclusive magazine article. Again, it's not very common, and they might show up in a magazine, and you could read more about them and find all kinds of stuff, what they're up to, what they're doing next, whatever projects or things like that. And they might get a personal question or two in there, and it was all exciting because it was just hanging on the line for just a little bit of information. And it could very well be that you would just anything, like there might be somebody saw them out in public doing something. It's like, I didn't know that so and so shopped at that store, and it was just kind of actually interesting, and it made it fun. Now, like I said, they had handlers who really maintained that because they're fully aware that once they go out there in the world, and if they say something or do something, then instantly the world is going to take notice. Because when you're super popular, people pay attention to those things. When you're nobody, no one really cares. No one really asks those kind of questions, and you just move on your day living, as most people do. And the biggest concern is that they would say something embarrassing or damaging. Michael Jordan once said, why doesn't, when he was asked why doesn't he get involved with politics, and because he's, known to be a Democrat, but he's quiet. He said, well, Republicans buy sneakers too. He fully was aware that I had to be very careful with what I say, how I say things, what I do, where I go, because I don't want to upset half of my fan base. And that's the same kind of thing that you would have with handlers. And it's not just fan base like for politics. It's about anything, about matters of religion, matters of what's your favorite soft drink. Just any people, will draw battle lines on all kinds of things. And it's amazing how carefully scripted stars used to be. So when they got out of a car and an interviewer or a reporter rush up with a camera and a microphone and start asking them questions, they were always very poised and very careful. And that's one thing that these handlers did. They were very careful on how to script them. So they would coach them to how to work with the media. And media operators would come up and they would ask all kinds of questions. So you should be ready. If a reporter comes up to you and asks you questions, these are the things you should say. And these are how you should say them. These are how you should hold your body, how you should smile, how you should look, how you should be dressed. All of these things were very, very well covered because, you'll see those occasional photos get leaked into like tabloids of like somebody who's out shopping and they're messy. Their hair's hardly done, if at all. They're just wearing bummy clothes. They just want to run down to the store, grab something and go home. They don't want to put on, $5,000 suit or $5,000 dress just to go shopping, but, lo and behold, some reporter gets a snapshot and it's not a very flattering shot. And they look really, really bummy. And people are like, oh, I can't believe how much they've let themselves go. I can't believe they would go out looking like that. Not realizing they're human beings. And you go out looking like that. I talked about that in one of my other episodes about how people go out and how they look when they go out to Walmart or even when they go to church and how badly they look. So why can't, if a celebrity wants to go out in a t-shirt and jeans, why can't they? Well, for whatever reason, when we put someone on a pedestal, we expect way more of them and kind of forget about the humanity. So anyway, they would be coached very heavily. Do this, wear this, stand this way, talk this way, smile, do this, and never get drawn into these kind of questions or these kind of arguments. Never discuss these 5 different things. And that's a very, common thing that used to be. Now, you can tell when you watch a lot of celebrities interact with media today, that's gone. I mean, we're not at the point where we know everything because, they're very willing to tell everybody, and the whole mindset is, I have a platform, I'm going to use it to affect change in things in which I believe. Now, the sad thing is a lot of times they don't necessarily believe it. They say it because, well, it gets them popularity credits. It's very well known that being a conservative in Hollywood is a big no-no. And if you start talking about conservative things, you're going to get blacklisted. We've seen that all the time. At somebody, whether as a sports figure or musician or whatever, goes and plays at a Republican event, instantly they're blacklisted from doing other things, and they're forced to go out and apologize for daring to like somebody of a different political party. But that's part of the problem. Part of the things that have gone on today with the rapid proliferation of discourse through social media, if I could even call it discourse. I mean, it's more like shouting. So you just put all that stuff out there, and now everybody knows everything, and they want to dig into everything. And a lot of people will gladly tell you everything, because again, I've got my platform. I want you to know how I feel about X, Y, and Z. And what used to be special disappeared very quickly, because instead of wondering what a celebrity has for breakfast, we now know. Instead of wondering about what kind of pet they have, we now know. And instead of wondering how they think about certain things, we now know. The downside is like I've said, the mystique goes away, but the other thing is we find out, frankly, a lot of our celebrities are stupid. I say that like, well, I mean, it's true. You listen to a lot of them talk, and it's clear they don't know anything about an issue. They just know that my people on my side are very, very concerned about said subject, so I'm going to speak on it too. And it's very clear that they don't. One of the key things of being an ethical speaker is to have phronesis, practical wisdom. And you've had those situations where you talked with somebody, in about 2 minutes you realize they don't know what they're talking about. That's a violation of Aristotle's 3 parts of ethics. So you hear that very often with celebrities. They start speaking about something, and it's pretty obvious that they have no clue. Maybe they saw a headline somewhere. Maybe somebody told them, someone whispered in their ear, this is the correct way to be thinking about this issue. Or even worse, that their handlers are saying, if you speak up on this side of things, it'll help you get the next movie deal. If you speak about this thing, it'll help you get more in your contract. If you speak up for this thing, it'll help you in these circles. Which is a crazy way to live your life. You should speak up on things you care about. I don't have a problem with that. It's a question of, do you know why you're doing it, or are you just doing it to manipulate other people? Or even worse, manipulate yourself, and you end up lying to yourself. So that's what we end up seeing a ton with. And what we end up seeing is this concept where we no longer truly have the Hollywood star. I mean, there are very, very few Hollywood stars who are just infamously quiet. I mean, there used to be some. I mean, Harrison Ford used to be incredibly reclusive, but even he's jumped into political things and can't help but talk about them. And you have other stars out there who just mention, some things or one things, and then next thing you know, they just start going off this all laundry list of all these things that they think and feel and care about. Again, they're allowed to speak their minds, but there's a cost. And the cost is that there's no longer any mystique about that person. There's no neat mystery. It used to be really, really cool to wonder, And today, it's just one of those things that trying to explain, and I realize as I'm explaining this, if you're a Gen Z or even a millennial, you have no idea what I'm even talking about. Because we know everything. I mean, and it's a whole different world that we're in now that it used to be prior to, to smartphones becoming a very common thing. Before Facebook in 2004, I mean, like before then, if you wanted to know something, it was just little bitty scraps, and you just were left wondering. So you'd see these figures on TV, and they'd be larger than life, and the only time they'd be really covered heavily is if they were promoting a new, movie, a new book, a new new song, or their team was going to some playoffs, or they got into trouble. And then, of course, it's hard to hide whenever you're doing a court case. You can't be scripted in PR when you're up up in the witness stand. You now have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And those scandalous events that happened, that's when the press would leap in and sink hooks into them, because that's their one chance to finally get into into who they are without having all of the facade in front of them. But it used to be, like I said, you'd have stars. You'd have, music stars. You'd have sports stars. You would have movie stars. But, I mean, can you really think of a true movie star today? One who's just, that person's name on the marquee will draw in just tons and tons of people. Millions of people show up just for that one person. It used to be we'd have several. You'd have several movie stars that people would show up just because their name was on the project. We don't really have that anymore. I mean, the last true movie star who's out there truly doing the old school Hollywood way of doing things, might be Tom Cruise. Maybe he gives himself thoroughly into every film. He works very hard. He behind the scenes, he knows the craft. He treats people well from what everything's been leaked out in the press when people talk about working with him. But he doesn't run out there and jump about politics and scream all kinds of weird things, about that kind of stuff. And it's just one of those things where he, is very appreciative of fans, and and his name tends to draw some people, but it's not necessarily a given, because he's had some flops in his career. But the thing is also, he's also been one of those ones who's learned the lesson, because whenever he left his first wife for his second wife, and went on a talk show and started hopping up and down the couch about how he feels about his wife, and people stopped and went, "Ooh, this is weird." And then he started going crazy, telling everyone he could about Scientology religion, and a lot of people went, "Ooh, I didn't realize that," and put the brakes on that. And instantly, that star power just quickly diminished, and he has spent a lot of time going back to being, private, and he just has slowly but surely regained a lot of that mystique. Now, people my age and older remember the couch hopping days, remember the Scientology days, and there's some trepidation. It's probably one of the things that's keeping him from being considered an actual star today, because of we remember those things. But there's some mystique that he has gotten back, and people who are younger than me might not remember or know about those kind of things, and they might just say, yeah, that Tom Cruise, he's kind of a bit of a mystery. I don't really know a lot about him, but he sure is really charismatic. He does a good job. He acts well, and he seems to have passion for his work. I'm intrigued. So if his name's on it, I'm intrigued. But we don't have really truly other stars. And social media does that, and unfairly, of course, to the female side of the camera. Think of how many women stars there are. Well, you can't really think of too many of them, and the biggest problem is because as soon as they get to be 25, 28 years old, Hollywood moves on for the next cutest younger thing. So as soon as they start getting old and start showing any kinds of age, Hollywood moves on, because social media isn't too kind to people who look old. And quite frankly, they're quite unfair to women who don't look good when they age, or any kind of issue that happens when they age. They don't want to see any flaws with a woman. A guy can look ruggedly handsome, but a woman is not allowed to look even remotely, seasoned, and boom, they moved on from. And that's a whole nother topic for another episode. But the thing of it is we hound and want to know everything we can, and we devour social media at a crazy pace, and we want to know more things, and we're constantly paying attention to these things, and we're visual creatures, so we keep consuming more and more things. As a result, it takes a lot for the entertainer, the star, the celebrity to step away from that limelight and to kind of hide from it, because again, there's that mythos is gone. We just don't know. We know too much about people now, and quite frankly, we do wish a lot of them would shut up. And thankfully, there are a lot of stars now that are starting to come out and saying, you know what, just shut up and sing the song. Shut up and act your role. Shut up and play your sport. And it used to be the fans were saying this stuff, and now it's the celebrities themselves telling other celebrities, look, this isn't our place. We're musicians, we're athletes, we're actors. That's what we do, that's what we know. We don't know what's going on in global conflicts around the world. We just don't know. So let's just not talk about it. Let's just go back to doing what we do and entertaining people. Now, that's, of course, a much more humble approach, which, having a superstar and telling him to be humble is, a whole nother matter, of course. But, it's this thing, it's that thing that's coming through in some voices and it's starting to pick up more. Because I think people on that side of the fence are starting to realize the damage that's being done. And we're seeing this in just absolute bomb movies, just flopping very hard at the box office, mostly because people, the actors can't help themselves. They go out and bash half the country or more and wonder why no one shows up to see their movies. I think they're starting to learn again something that we've known for decades, but for whatever reason, in the craziness of the social media era, they tend to throw that all out and prioritize being able to say what they want. And it's come with consequence. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, and also leave a comment. Maybe you know of a celebrity who has tanked their project or their careers because they just couldn't keep quiet. And maybe you know a celebrity that maybe does fit the status of a star. And, tell me about it in the comments. If you didn't like today's episode, thanks very much for tuning in this long anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.